So continuing with our examples of restraints, here's a limit stop. Basically, we're preventing the pipe from moving in the axial direction. Now, you see these hinges here. You might say this is a rod model again, but I'm going to say that the purpose of this is to prevent axial motion only. So I would then be supplying a restraint, maybe on the center line, which is just an X restraint, or a limit stop. Again, that's a local definition of a restraint type or direction. Now, the other issue that we might have here is, well, what if this is a long attachment here? Perhaps I might want to put the support up here. Then I'm going to get a bending moment on the pipe. I might be concerned about tearing this support off the pipe. So I would not get that bending moment unless I put this in the system. And there might be some additional modeling involved in the piping system. I might run this pipe size to the wall and run a rigid element into the center line of the pipe because I don't have all this flexibility. I only have this little flexibility on here. So we could make this more complicated still, but basically my first pass, I'm putting a limit stop, maybe at the center line, maybe at the true point of connection. Here's another plus Y support. Clearly, the question is, where do you put the node for the support? On the center line of the pipe? Well, if I have a large Y load on this run, I might get a larger bending moment on the pipe, and also I'm going to introduce a greater bending moment down below. If I put this restraint here, I will not see this bending moment. So I would probably want to move it over here to this point and run maybe a rigid element out here to this support point and put the support there. So it's a plus Y restraint, maybe put the coefficient of friction in there and use that model. Here's a boxed in pipe support. Got these lugs welded to the pipe and then the guide on the lugs that are connected to the steel. So this pipe can't move up and down, can't move left and right, and it can't twist. Whether you have 2 lugs or maybe 4 lugs, it doesn't really change the model. So we have a Y restraint, we have an X restraint or guide, and then finally the RZ restraint. We can't rotate it but the Z axis. You would hope there's not much rotation there. I would expect to see not a large load here for RZ, and if you do, that might affect the design of these lugs and the overall support structure. Now this one, I just wanted to have another example where we have a Y spring model. Actually we have X spring, Y spring, Z spring. These are spring supports. Now typically in Caesar 2, you do not use a restraint to model a hanger, a spring hanger. The spring hanger does have stiffness, but it also has preload. So we would use the hanger definition for most of these types of situations. But let's say I have an existing spring out in the field right now, and I know what the spring rate is, and I know how much remaining deflection is allowed before it compresses completely and locks up. And I don't expect this to be a common model used in your analyses, but we have this Y spring model, which allows me to define that remaining free motion before it locks up. So I would define a restraint, a Y spring. I can specify the stiffness and the preload on that spring. That's a theoretical cold load. But now I have this extra field here, this clearance before it bottoms out X. So if it closes this dimension here, then it will go to a rigid restraint. So basically this is a bilinear restraint with some preload on it. We have the initial stiffness, and if the deflection gets to this level here, it will then go to a rigid restraint. Again, most springs aren't designed for this, but if you have an existing system and you see it bottomed out, you could model it. Or if you're going to cut into that line and do more work with it, you would want to include that in your analysis as well. Kind of a special case here, but we have the capability. Here's a support where it's basically a rod. That would be a Y support, maybe a plus Y rod to have it swing around. But we see this second element in here, and all of a sudden it can't move in the X and Y directions. I don't care what the orientation is. This piece of pipe can't move in the Y, and the pipe cannot move in the X direction. But looking at this model, we might want to concern ourselves with the deflection in the Z direction out of the plane here. If we see we get a large number here, if it wants to move laterally in the direction of the viewing direction here, this support structure may be inadequate. So I put a Y restraint and a guide or X restraint as well. Here's the example we had earlier on in the introduction. I know several new users, they would model these gaps. These gaps can get us involved with non-convergence issues. It's a detail that causes more difficulty than provides solution. So I would specify the X restraint or guide with no gap. Now, I am not modeling the Y restraint here. So what am I going to do? I'm going to have to monitor the vertical displacement of this result. I'll check on my load cases, and if my vertical deflection is always less than these values here, my model is adequate even though I did not model the Y restraint. If I look at my output and I see that it moves up more than this gap here or moves down more than that gap there, then the model is incorrect for that load case. And I would have to go back in and model the Y with a gap or change the design so that this gap is large enough to allow that free motion. Now, in this model here, looks like an anchor to me, but where's the anchor? Is it here up in the pipe or down here? Well, I'll say it's down here at the bottom, so I'll run an element down to this point and call it an anchor down here. Now, you could argue too that, well, that's a U-bolt just like that U-bolt that we saw earlier on. And it's only an X and a Y restraint, and maybe depends how tight it is, whether it's RZ. Again, if I have low load up here, an anchor is going to be adequate. I don't have to worry about the full definition here. So basically, you can go either way. Either call it an anchor or just an X and a Y. If this is a long leg or for a very small diameter, then the flexibility will play a role in the overall modeling here. My guess is I put an anchor down here and I'm not going to see much deflection here anyway. And I would say that'd be a good model. Here's our box support. I have a support in the Y direction. I also have a support in the X direction with a gap. I'm not too concerned with the gap, whatever there was there in the Y direction, but I am worried about this gap in the horizontal direction. In many cases, these gaps are put in to avoid contact with a pipe. So if you close the gap, maybe that is an indication of poor design, and you want a larger gap so it can open up the width of this box. Now, if there's ever an anchor, this would be an anchor. We're just supporting the pipe right on its center line. We have enough steel around here. The only reason I would take a look at the output in monitoring the anchor loads is that if I get very, very large loads, I have to make sure I've got enough steel here to hold the pipe in place. So this would be an anchor. Here's another rod, but we have a slope to it. So again, you lay a vector with an arrowhead on it, and the arrowhead points to the pivot point. So this is going to swing this direction. So we're getting a little complicated here. This will be a plus X rod. And I say B comma A comma 0. So that's B in the X, A in the Y. So that's from tail to tip. There's my pivot point, so it's going to swing around this way. And I also define the length of this link here to get this arc of free motion. You can also specify a preload if it was actually spring can and a stiffness. These are the two terms that we can modify on the rod type. Let me also add to that, as soon as I put this parenthetic vector behind it, I don't care whether I say plus X plus Y or plus Z rod, this will trump any setting on the global vector with this actual vector of that link. Now, if you understand this one, I think you got the gaps and the plus Y's and plus X's down. Here we have a pipe going through a bulkhead, and we have differing gaps in different directions. If you recall, in the introduction, we talked about plus Y's and gaps. On guides, we had that plus X restraint with a gap. Remember that the direction of the restraint defines the free motion, and then the gap is what is required to close that gap to start the restraint. So this first one, here I'll color code them. Here I have a restraint in the Y direction. Now this is your basic plus Y restraint. That looks like a plus Y restraint, so I'll put it in as a plus Y, and the gap to become active will be D. This gap has to close for this restraint to become active. It says free to move in the positive Y direction. Now you know it's going to hit this restraint, but that's a different restraint. Let's go on to the next one. This will be the negative Y restraint. So the pipe is free to move in the negative Y. Now it's going to contact this restraint when it moves at D, but this is a different restraint, so it's a negative Y restraint, and the gap to close, it will be on the C side. Now we're going to work with the X direction. So what would this restraint be? This restraint does not restrain motion in the positive X direction. That's your positive X restraint, and this is the gap that must be closed to make it active. So plus X, gap A. Now the last one's pretty much left over, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but this is the restraint defining free motion in the negative X direction. Again, that's kind of backwards, talking about the restraint is called negative X, but I just call that the free motion. And the gap, this is the gap that must be closed, so that's my gap B. Okay, so there you have a lot of different types of restraints, and if you think of others that are kind of interesting, send them in through the system, and perhaps we can address them in a future video, or take a picture of something out in the field and send it in. Perhaps we can update it that way. I'll give you one more as a bonus question or bonus item here. On our forum, every once in a while, people talk about a spring can underneath the pipe, and you want to put friction at that point. A common point is that the support pillar post underneath the spring can move around a little bit before it comes in contact with the can itself. So there's some free motion laterally. Now we have a spring in the vertical direction. How could I possibly get friction in the model as the pipe wants to slide on the top of that restraint? And this is kind of an interesting combination. We have a hanger at node 20 with a C node to node 21. We didn't talk about C nodes today, but this is getting us down to that friction point, 21. Then I define a restraint in the Y direction, a plus Y restraint at node 21 with a coefficient of friction. So now I've got a friction point down here. So as the pipe node 20 develops a normal load, I will get a friction force. Now, how can I get the friction to act at this node 21? Well, I have to connect 20 to 21 in both the X and Z directions. So these colors are color-coded for these pieces of input. Here's my hanger, is the blue. My friction will be collected at node 21 on that plus Y restraint with a coefficient of friction. But I want to try to pull the pipe at 21. The only way I get 21 to move laterally to work with this friction is to put the lateral node C node pairs at these 2 points. So now the pipe, ignoring that little slop up here at the top of the support post, I can now get some friction down at the base related to the amount of load on the spring can itself. Well, there you have it. That's our restraint definition in Caesar 2. Again, if you have any others that you would like us to include here, send them in and we'll update this as we can. Thank you.